Hello, I'm Steve Boyer. I'm one of the worship leaders here at Brick Lane Community Church. I'm glad to be speaking with you today. My wife says that I am an immoderate user of condiments. What she has in mind there is mostly salt and pepper, butter, probably especially ketchup, which I tend to like a lot of. Heidi always says, you can't taste the food. You need to have just a tiny bit so that it spices things up. It's just a hint of flavor in the background. She is right, of course. On the other hand, I find that I myself am not especially good at detecting things that are subtle in the background, whether flavors or other things. I need things to become pretty big in order for me to notice them and take them seriously. Putting it that way makes me think of a line from the 20th century Christian author Flannery O'Connor as she described her own short stories and novels. It's in the middle of a sort of a paragraph that fits together well and describes why it is that so many of the characters in her short stories are, as they were often described, grotesque, in sort of the technical sense that they include features that are unrealistically sort of odd, often ugly, certainly frightening in one way or another. Listen to what Flannery O'Connor says about her writing here. I found her work hard to warm up to. I encountered this and it helped me. Listen. O'Connor. The novelist with Christian concerns will find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to him. And his problem will be to make these appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural. In this context, the author may well be forced to take ever more violent means to get his vision across to this hostile audience. When you can assume that your audience hold the same beliefs you do, you can relax a little and use more normal ways of talking to it. But when you have to assume that it, your audience, does not hold the same beliefs you do, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout. To the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures. I like that last phrase, the large and startling figures. In order to see ordinary life well, it seems as though we sometimes need to have ordinary life made terribly, frighteningly larger than life. So think with me about that. It seems to me that the coronavirus here in 2020 has presented to us large and startling figures of an ordinary but somewhat subtle feature of reality. Death, of course, as we all know, is not a new thing. It has always been around, you might say. But we frequently, very easily, in fact, we push it to the background. We associate death with nursing homes, not with ordinary life. We think of automobile accidents that suddenly intrude on ordinary life. Unless we have a child that has to go into the hospital, or a parent who is aging, or something along those lines, death seems as though it is fairly far away from us. But it's always there. The coronavirus makes it clear that it is always threatening us. Do you feel that? Always a threat. Now, here's the funny thing. Christians, at their best, have always been aware of that perpetual threat, the universal presence and reality of death. This is a very common theme in Christian writings for 20 centuries. There's a constant reaffirmation of the significance of death as we try to understand how it is that life works. Even though we often push it to the background, it remains the case that, in the words of St. Augustine in the 5th century, that life is a constant race toward death. Augustine says that everything that we do in life is tainted by death. Every joy leads to a sorrow. Every strength leads to a weakness. Everything that seems good seems to have an underside as well. And of course, ultimately leads to death. It's pretty depressing, isn't it? A race toward death, says Augustine. Now, Christians have not always included that kind of language in order to give the fairly common message that we often hear these days during COVID-19 anxieties. So Christians have not tended to think of this, of death, that is, as merely a fact that we need to be reminded of. The point typically has not been the standard secular point that our culture tends to rely on a lot, right? You hear a lot of people say in our time, in light of this sort of crisis, I find myself really wanting to get back to and to cherish the things that I had overlooked before. I want to spend more time with my family, just being close together in a way that we can't do it now. I want to cherish the little things more. I don't want to take things for granted so much. You've heard that. Now, this is true, of course. This is a good lesson to draw after a fashion. It's an ordinary and correct, I think, human response. Interestingly enough, it is not yet a distinctively Christian response. Instead, Christians have tended to think about this universal presence of death as more of a revelation. It's a kind of revelation, you might say, an unveiling of the nature or the meaning of life itself. We could be even a little more specific than that. It is a revelation of the intolerable brokenness of the world as we live in it. That's what the coronavirus really shows us. It shows us that long before there was a coronavirus, the world was hurting in ways that if we saw it clearly, we would be in tears all the time. So you think about this. Of the 8 billion or so people on planet Earth, Christians have said, not one will die who was not already very near to death, was not already racing toward death. This is a problem. But the message that Christians typically derive from this is not, so we need to get used to it, we need to recognize that life is short. That's not what Christians say. The classical Christian message has been, if that's what the world is like, there is something dreadfully wrong with the world. The world is not what it ought to be. Who can imagine a God making this kind of world? I take it that nobody can. Christians say, God did not make this kind of world. Instead, there is a brokenness deep here, and it's a brokenness that God himself, by his own promise, is going to make right. By his own promise, God has already begun to make it right. And the day will come when we will see it with our eyes. Friends, Christ is risen. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. We will see it, and death will be no more. I hope you will live today. Please, brothers and sisters, live today in the hope of something larger than the coronavirus, in a hope that is larger than death itself. Christ offers that kind of hope. Live there. Amen. God bless you as you go through this day, this week, this season.